We're having a quality of care session. We're going to start with Cassandra Simmons from the World Health Regional Office for Europe, and she's going to present on some work that will be launched soon. So we're getting a preview on promoting quality management in long-term care. All yours, Cassandra.
That's great. Thank you so much, Adelina. And thank you everyone for also joining in at this time. I see a lot of faces also in the European region, and I know it's getting late, so I appreciate people sticking around. Thank you so much, Adelina, for the invite today. And yeah, so my name is Cassandra Simmons. I'm working as a consultant for long-term care with WHO Europe. And I'm thrilled to be here today to be presenting some of the ongoing work that WHO Europe has in the area of quality management. So to give you a bit of context, though, about what I'm presenting today, so I'll be presenting a sort of conceptual framework or a structured approach of how we can think about quality management. And this is coming from a technical document that's going to be launched by WHO Europe later this year, December, in Athens. And it's basically aiming to give a sort of structured approach for how countries can think about approaching quality management and long-term care. So first, I want to start off by trying to define quality in long-term care. And of course, many of you in research and that have been in this field will know there have been a lot of debates and discussions over the last decades about how we can really define quality in long-term care. And as part of this conceptual framework, we try to start off by proposing a definition. And what we propose is to define quality in long-term care as the degree to which care services contribute to maximizing well-being and quality of life and increase the likelihood of personal and health outcomes that are consistent with the individual preferences, human rights, and dignity of both care users and their caregivers. And in addition to being a mouthful, I just want to highlight a few key aspects here that when we are referring to quality in long-term care, the population of interest we're talking about is not just those that are already experiencing declines in intrinsic capacity and functional ability, but also those that are at risk of or risk of further declines. And in trying to define quality in long-term care, we're also acknowledging in the technical documents a number of challenges. So first, of course, we see a lot of fragmentation in service delivery across health and social care continuum. And so when we start thinking about quality of care and when we think of it in terms of quality of life and well-being, it becomes difficult as to how we can have service providers accountable when there are many services being provided. We also acknowledge the challenge that there are different perspectives as to what constitutes quality in long-term care. If you ask a provider versus a regulator versus a care user themselves, there will be different perspectives of what quality is. We also acknowledge that a large share of long-term care is carried out informally and by family members. And of course, this is a little bit difficult then to think about what quality in this sense is. And finally, we recognize that when we're conceptualizing quality in long-term care as being measured by well-being and quality of life, then we're going to need a flexible approach to quality. Well-being and quality of life can be subjective aspects, things that might vary from person to person. And so in line with this, we need a flexible approach to quality. So as part of this conceptual framework, we propose some values that should be underpinning quality in long-term care. Some of these might look familiar. They're coming from, or they're very much related to the WHO's framework for quality in healthcare. And so the principles that should be underpinning quality in long-term care include aspects such as person-centeredness, integration, not only in terms of across health and social care services, but also between formal and informal cares, and so on. Quality in long-term care should also be safe, effective, equitable, efficient, and timely. There should be a strong orientation to being provided in the community, which aligns with the preferences of society and of the population. And finally, care services should be available, accessible, and affordable, being covered under universal health coverage. Now, one of the fundamental aspects of this conceptual framework that we're proposing is that there should be a shift in the way we think about quality from a quality assurance approach and instead towards a quality management approach. And so what do we mean by this? So when we're referring to quality assurance, we're referring to the fact that countries will set minimum standards for quality service or for care services. And then they implement a range of mechanisms and interventions and activities to basically determine if service providers are meeting these minimum standards. So we see quality assurance very much as being a focus on complying with the standards in place. But what we're proposing is that we need to shift away from this towards a quality management approach, which is rather about promoting a continuous quality improvement approach. So what this includes is using all of the tools, the mechanisms, and interventions available to try to ensure and improve the processes, structures, and outcomes of care. And so what does this actually look like? What does a quality management approach look like? So it includes a continuous focus on quality improvement. We propose that quality should be iterative, it should be cyclical, there should be a continuous updating and adaptation in order to push the minimum standards that we have in the sector. So some of you may be familiar then with this continuous quality management cycle we have here, but this is what we think really embodies these values. There should be a planning stage of thinking of quality, the processes, and trying to identify what challenges there are. There should be an implementation phase where we try to implement services and solutions. There should move on to a measuring and evaluation phase where we think about these processes and the outcomes that we've achieved, and then reflecting on these results and trying to identify further areas of improvement. And the whole idea being is that with each of these cycles, both within a provider perspective, but also at the system level, with each of these cycles, we go around and we slightly bump up that minimum standard so that we're constantly reaching for a higher level of quality. And it's a continuous process. It's never ending. There's never a point where we stop and say, okay, that's it. It's a continuous process over time. So within this conceptual framework, we also highlight some key areas that policymakers have at their disposal to invest in order to try to reach this quality management approach. So we highlight user engagement. Of course, it's very important that users are engaged both in the planning and provision of their care, but also in monitoring quality through user-reported outcomes. We highlight the needs assessment as a key critical component. This idea being that the needs assessment identifies needs and often links to establishing eligibility. So of course, when we think about quality of care and services being provided, the needs assessment is a foundational aspect leading to that. We also highlight the health and care workforce. It's not only crucial, of course, that the health and care workforce has the necessary skills and qualifications to provide good quality care, but there should also be incentives for them to also participate in quality improvement. We highlight digital technologies, not just from the side of having good quality, systematic, robust data continuously in order to monitor progress over time, but also from the perspective of having digital technology in the provision of care to improve the quality of care provided. And finally, we also highlight governance. So it's crucial to have a clear division of roles across the stakeholders at different levels in the system. It's important to have accountability in all of these roles, and it's important to set goals both at the service delivery and system level. We also highlight in this conceptual framework some approaches that help us to reach this quality improvement approach. So we highlight first, measuring what really matters. So we make the case that user-reported outcomes should be a common measure used across countries, because when we think about the final goals of care being maximizing individual well-being and quality of life, then of course we need measures to reflect this, and it's important that we incorporate users in this regard. Another way is also creating incentives for providers, whether financial or non-financial or a combination of both. It's important that we incentivize providers to not just focus on the minimum standards, but to also go beyond them and also to shift away from this focus on cost containment measures. And finally, it also includes an expansion of roles across all of the stakeholders involved in quality management. And it requires thinking about things such as reflexive forms of regulation, making space for joint learning, creating a culture where people feel comfortable across the different groups to have honest conversations about quality, and an openness to really conceptualize new ways of working together. Now, I'm mindful that I'm shortly coming to the end of my time, but part of the technical document that's going to be launched later this year also includes a number of country case studies and a regional case study to try to exemplify how quality management looks and is organized across countries. Now, I won't have too much time then to go too much into detail of the case studies that we have, but I just want to highlight a few points to try to exemplify what we're talking about here. So one of the case studies that we have as part of the collection is Austria. And I think it's an interesting case because Austria has quite a decentralized system of quality management. So although there are minimum quality standards at the national level, Federal states are actually responsible for issuing more detailed regulations, and they're also responsible for assuring quality of long-term care. So this leads to quite substantial variation across the country, across the regions. But just to highlight then some of the mechanisms they have in place, some of the interventions they have to try to elicit quality improvement. So on the one hand, at the national level, Austria has this voluntary national quality certificate for nursing and care homes. And this is based on an external audit, and it's based on whether they have a quality management system in place and they're working towards quality improvement. So it works as a sort of public-facing mechanism to show that they are conscious about quality. There's also a quality certificate for placement agencies and 24-hour care. And this is basically a voluntary certificate that agencies can receive to show that they do comply with nationally set guidelines. And then in Austria, across a lot of nursing homes, there are care satisfaction surveys that are used then to improve the services provided. Another case.
You have about 1 minute left, Cassie.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. I will wrap it up. We also have a case study on Ireland. I think Ireland has a lot of wonderful initiatives ongoing to try to improve quality of care in nursing homes. One that I would highlight that I think is really interesting is the thematic quality improvement program that they have. So HIQA basically develops guidelines on a certain theme, and then they require providers to carry out a self-assessment in terms of this theme and to develop a quality improvement plan that the care home then follows. I think this is an interesting initiative that they have. Okay, I'm almost done, Adelina. I wanted to also highlight Greece. Although we do highlight quite a range of case studies within the country case studies and the regional case study, and all countries are at different varying levels of development. And I think this is important to highlight because a lot of countries are still on the path to implementing a quality improvement approach. And what we identified in Greece is that there are still some challenges in establishing a basic fundamental quality assurance mechanisms. And it's crucial to establish these before moving on to a quality improvement approach. But we do have some ongoing work there that's aiming to try to improve quality of care through piloting quality indicators and strengthening capacity building and so on. So final slide. If you find all of this interesting, as I mentioned, we will be launching this technical document later in Athens this year in December. It'll contain this conceptual framework about how we can think of quality and long-term care, and it'll include these 6 country case studies and a regional case study as well. And of course, always open to getting in contact with anyone. If you found that this really resonated with your work, definitely please reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. And after you've presented in Greece, we'd love to hear about this online at GOLTC as well, if you can.
Absolutely.
Just a quick question for you, whether you listened to the previous speakers. I know you couldn't be there because you had a conflicting schedule, but you will, of course, watch the video very carefully because there were some really interesting things on the built environment and how to improve quality and also the role of research in that I know you'll find fascinating. So the next speaker we have is Bellis van Berg. And while you get your slides set up, Bellis, I'm going to mention that Bellis and Henk Nies have started a new interest group at the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care. We have shared the link in the chat. Thank you, Anna, that you can start joining as well. So we're going to continue this conversation. This is definitely a topic that the Observatory is very interested on, and we're delighted that we will now have a forum to have regular discussions. So Bellis, you want to get your slides? I forgot to mention that Bellis is from Vilans in the Netherlands, and she'll be presenting on improving and supporting quality of care in Dutch nursing homes.
Okay, thank you for this invitation, and thank you for the interesting presentation, Cassandra. I think my presentation is quite well in line with yours. I'd like to tell you about improving and supporting quality of care in Dutch nursing homes and our experiences of a nationwide program we conducted in the Netherlands between 2018 and 2022. The name of the program was Dignity and Pride, and the objective was to get sufficient time and attention and high quality care in nursing homes by implementing the Dutch National Quality Framework for Nursing Home Care. And the main component of this nationwide program were improvement trajectories at the level of nursing home facilities. And these consisted of a nursing home quality scan and customized support by external change agents. This Dutch quality framework for nursing home care is actually based on the Irish quality framework and consisted of 9 themes of what residents and relatives could expect from nursing home care. So this is person-centered care, good living and well-being, and resident safety. These are the care outcome themes. And also what is needed within nursing homes to provide good quality of care. The conditional themes like a culture of learning and improvement, leadership, responsive workforce, use of resources, and use of information. And when nursing homes participated in the program, they first had to get insight into quality of care at their facility. And for this, we constructed a quality scan that consisted of several steps. The first one was to fill in a questionnaire, a self-questionnaire on these 8 themes of the quality framework from all the different perspectives at the nursing home facility. So residents and relatives were asked to fill out this questionnaire, but also the care workers and volunteers and management and staff. And then the results of this questionnaire was interpreted and analyzed by 2 external experts. And they also prepared a 3-hour dialogue session in which the results were discussed with these different perspectives on the table, around the table. And then they get consensus about what needs attention. So they assigned color labels to these different teams, ranging from red, this is a serious issue, to green, this is outstanding at the facility. And this was the basis for the improvement plan. In total, more than 500 nursing home facilities participated in this program. And at the start and at the end of the participation, they filled out this quality scan. And besides this, they get tailored support from external support coaches. And this was tailored based on the results. So if a team was sufficient or outstanding, no support was provided on the team, and other teams, they could receive support. But they also could choose to work on it independently. So this is a figure of the results. Actually, on all the 8 teams, we took a whole system approach. So all the teams were important, and we saw that in all the teams significant improvements were made. But the greatest improvements were observed in the teams of resident safety, person-centered care, and a culture for learning and improvement. And then we also wanted to know whether it was important to get this support from the external coaches. And what we saw was for the care outcomes, facilities were able to improve the care outcomes, so person-centered care, living and well-being and safety on their own, so independently from the expert coaches. But when we looked at the conditional teams, so learning and improvement, leadership, staff composition, use of resources and information, it was more important to get this support from the external coaches. So we see the blue lines show the improvement with the external coaches, and the gray lines the dark gray line was independently. We see significant more improvement in the blue lines. But because the external coaches, it is not easy to get this support from external coaches. It's very expensive as well, a national program. So we were interested whether these organizational conditions are important for care outcomes. Is it the hard work to get these organizational conditions at a good level. And we see in our analysis that it was really significantly related with good care outcomes, but also especially the themes of learning and improvement were significantly related to good care outcomes, but also the responsive workforce, especially the knowledge and the skills of the workforce, and the use of resources. And this was also mainly the evaluation of practices and work processes, and the use of technology was very important. These kind of topics in the questionnaire. So what can we conclude from this program? The first thing is that the quality scan, including all these relevant perspectives, stimulated openness, dialogue, and awareness on quality of care at the nursing home facility. And it also identified steps that are needed to improve the quality of care at the facility. Second, with the support of the external expert coaches, notable enhancements were realized at all of the 8 teams of the framework. But also the support from the external expert coach was a significant factor in enhancing the organizational conditions, but a less crucial as element for optimizing just the care outcomes, because these need more local interventions, and the organizational conditions need more complex healthcare interventions. And then we saw also in our analysis that the organizational conditions are really of substantial importance for positive care outcomes, especially a supportive environment and a culture of learning and improvement. It is difficult to realize that, but it is also conducive and valuable for good care outcomes. Is what we saw in the data that we provided in our program. So this is what we would like to share with you. And we have a report about this. And if you'd like to get in touch about this, you can email me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bellis. And feel free, I don't know if the report is in Dutch or in English, but feel free to put it in the chat.
It's in
so people can access as well. And I look forward to continuing the discussion in the interest group. And now we're going to hear from a Dutch presenter. And I am delighted to see Milan van Keulen from the Erasmus School of Health Policy and Management in the Netherlands. And he's going to present on rethinking regulation, person-centered service provision, reflexive regulation in dementia care networks.
Thank you, Annalena. My name is Milan van Keulen. I'm a PhD candidate at the Erasmus School of Health and Policy Management, and I will present something about rethinking regulating person-centered service provision. But first, let's start at the beginning. So, researching regulation of person-centered long-term care. Why exactly? So, person-centered care, as Cassandra already mentioned, and Bellis just now as well, is an important quality aspect of long-term care. It's also one of the action areas of the United Nations Decade of Healthy Aging. So it's an important ambition as part of long-term care. And that's why it's also needed for regulators to assess this person-centeredness. But the question, what is good person-centered care, is quite difficult to answer. It's difficult to pin down if you really need to assess it, because then you need to reduce it to something that is accessible while it's ambiguous and temporal and situational. So regulators are influential change agents in this for the quality of services, because they often provide a common conception of what is considered to be good care, which are then used for like internal audits by care organizations. So they have a performative effect on the care practices with their ways of working. If you look at the current practices in the case of the Netherlands, they assess individual care organizations, and they do this by translating these complex realities like person-centered care through concrete, often measurable standards. So these standards are used to provide this common conception. These are usually focused on risks. They want to mitigate the biggest risks. And they are sector specific. So for example, if you have social support, home care, and mental health care, but these all have different regulators, while they're all helping the same person. And then lastly, what constitutes as information is greatly determined by aspects of care that are possible to observe during their visits of care organizations. So often focused on documentations or like a positivistic notion of what is inspectable, which can which doesn't have to focus on like emotional aspects that are so important for person-centered care as well. If we look at what people with dementia expect from person-centered care, is that they share with us maintaining a sense of agency while they're increasingly becoming more dependent. So they're not really focused on these risks. And these personal needs transcend the sectors, so they transcend home care or the general practitioner. They are broader than that. And they have a lot of uncertainty, and well, like because it transcends the sectors, there are multiple addressees in this sector. So there's a tension or conflict between the current ways of regulating person-centered care and what person-centered care asks for. And then there's this notion of reflexive regulation, which is often used in climate literature about climate change, because the climate crisis also transcends our borders of our countries. So it's theorized that this notion can also help us in person-centered care, as it also transcends the borders of the sectors we designed in healthcare. So it's about jointly arriving at a focus for improvement, finding the root of the problem, and instead of assessing norms, is about stimulating this process. So in order to assess, well, not assess, but in order to stimulate the person-centeredness of public services, the users are the touchstone in dialogue with the service providers. So who better to judge if the services are person-centered, and if all these professionals are working together, than the one person who is experiencing it all, the person with dementia. So this is what we tried. I did an ethnographic study, and I followed the Dutch healthcare regulator in their experimentation with this. And I followed the specific department of network care and prevention, which is a relatively new department, which already has no clear norms, no clear standards, and not like one actor responsible, instead of like assessing a single care organization. So this is already closer to the reflexive form of regulation that we aim for. And the aim of this project was to stimulate the conditions for good person-centered services. And the role of the regulator in this was just not assessing the quality, but facilitating the stimulation of good person-centered services. I don't have time to go into the details of exactly what we did, but it was a participatory action research approach. And basically what the regulator did was, in every network that they visit, they interviewed people with dementia, they visit local Alzheimer's support groups, they talked to local initiatives to get a sense of what people were experiencing in that specific region. And then they brought these reflections or these insights to a group reflection with this whole network of professionals who were working, all the care organizations, the municipalities, all the parties involved in this specific dementia network, and reflect on these findings to stimulate the collaboration and the person-centeredness. And then they shared a report on the findings, what they found together. And this was a really challenging for inspectors. So we're going to do 3 more networks to come to broader to better and more insights, because only at the end of network 3 we were somewhat close to what we aimed for. But I will share some first insights on these first networks. And I think the most important one is that the reasoning from these experience problems really helped in mobilizing the conversation. And when reasoning from the policy, it really paralyzed the conversation. So these policies are often not too attuned to the specific situations or have no room for exemptions. So the conversations got stuck in trying to figure out who's responsible for what and what exactly is the rule or not, or the policy. And when the client's experiences were brought in, it really helped because these problems don't stop until the person is helped. So there's a collective accountability is created to these clients' narratives and a responsibility to these problems. Let's see, there was also, after every network, the regulators were forced to reflect in this method on their own methods and if they worked or not, instead of what they usually do is having a method and applying that everywhere while they may have different goals. So they really appreciated this forced reflection. And then listening first created room for local problems. Instead of assessing everyone on the basis of the same standards or norms, there was now room for the different local problems. And there were quite a lot of different local problems, which helped by listening first to these experiences. And then there were also some challenges in the sense that the flexibility needed of this or asked from this reflexive regulation was really quite a lot more than the formal structures of the Dutch healthcare regulator provided. So there was a continuous tension where the inspectors were working between in formal structures and the room needed for this experiment. There was also there's quite a different role for inspectors. So instead of assessing a standard, they have to facilitate a conversation and a group conversations, which comes with a lot of more uncertainties, which was also quite difficult. And this getting a sense of the experienced reality of in different regions was also quite a challenge to do this quickly. But this also was because inspectors had to deal with this new kind of information, this phenomenological information about experienced realities that they were not used to have or use. They didn't really know what to do with it. Yeah, so we will continue this project to learn more, but for now, these were the first insights. And if you have questions or want to learn more, please contact me.
Thank you so much, Milan, and we'll be following your project because it's a very, very interesting approach and really changes how we think about regulation. And so the last presenter, José Luis Fernández, is not able to join us, unfortunately, but I'm very delighted that our last speaker for today is going to be Juliette Malley, my colleague, who's going to be talking to us about quality of care versus outcomes. And Juliette, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Adelina, for inviting me to talk a little bit about quality and outcomes in long-term care. And well done to everyone for making it through to the end of the day. It's been a long day, but there have been some really interesting presentations I've sat in on. So hopefully I can round it off and do justice to all the excellent things that we've heard about today. I thought in terms of kind of giving you a bit of a roundup about quality and outcomes in long-term care, what I thought I'd do first was just talk a little bit about why we care about quality and outcomes. Then I'm going to go into some definitions. There's quite a bit of overlap with what Cassandra was talking about earlier, which is hopefully a good thing rather than a bad thing. And then because I was asked to think about, perhaps some of the kind of definitional problems or so, or sometimes why there's kind of confusion between quality and outcomes. I want to focus a little bit on that and try and get into what explains some of this confusion around what we mean by quality and what we mean by outcomes. Okay. Right, so why do we care about quality and outcomes? So on the one hand, we can see that there's large quantities of public and private resources are invested in long-term care. So we can see there's variation across different countries, but on average, we're talking about 2% of GDP being invested in long-term care. But on the other hand, when we look at what we're getting from that money, you don't have to do very much searching to find that there are a huge number of scandals. So we've got fraud, we've got exploitation, we've also got incidences of poor care, so conflicts, violence, abandonment, neglect, in stealing as well, coming in long-term care too. And also, if we look a little bit further, we also find that not only have we unsafe problems around care, but we also have a lot of unmet need as well out there. So this really starts to raise a lot of questions about whether the money is being spent well and how potentially we could spend it better. So when we're talking about quality and outcomes, we're generally invoking these ideas in the context of discussions about performance. So thinking about improving the performance of the system, programs and services, and really also ensuring that services are having a positive and not a negative impact on people's lives. But also we're talking about quality and outcomes in the context of accountability. So we've heard about that in the previous presentation, thinking about it in the context of regulation, but also holding government to account for public expenditure, as well as holding those organizations and individuals to account for their behavior. Okay, so moving on to definitions. Thinking about how we get a grip on what it is we mean by quality. Well, the dictionary definition is very simple. So we're talking about the degree of goodness or worth of something. And that's very easy to say, but it's much more difficult to determine what that actually looks like in practice. So we can we know what it is. We know in our hearts what it is when we see it, but it's inherently a subjective thing, quality. So given is very subjective, and given those challenges and really defining it, what are the approaches that have been used in long-term care for getting towards a kind of agreed definition, I suppose, for what we mean by quality? So I've identified 3 approaches here. I'm sure you could probably identify more, but I think these are the ones that are most seen. So the first is perhaps a lot more common in retail and manufacturing, where you have kind of luxury, premium kind of brands, so a prestige approach. So it's not common, but I see it emerging definitely in the UK, where you see some kind of luxury home care homes. They're trying really to suggest that the quality of the products is somewhat different in these kind of luxury care homes. But perhaps a much more common approach is what we label the scientific approach. So here, essentially, we're trying to identify what good quality looks like. And the ways we've seen that happening are really through kind of expert-derived standards. Primarily, we're thinking about using these in inspection. That's certainly where these ideas have developed in that context. More recently, I'd say we've seen a lot more kind of move as well towards the establishment of evidence-based guidelines around good practice. So thinking about processes, how can we specify exactly what good practice would look like along with these particular care processes? So then the third approach we see is a consumerist approach. So I would say this is something that emerged really in the 1980s or so as a kind of corrective, essentially, to the perception that public services at that time had really been captured by the interests of services and staff or managers, and they were just really unresponsive to the needs and preferences of users. So what we saw at that time was really the emergence of involving users in assessing care. Particularly, we saw lots of satisfaction surveys. But over time, this kind of idea has developed somewhat. It's kind of happily become connected, I would say, with a empowerment discourse as well. So we see service users being much more engaged, much more involved, their families as well becoming much more involved in the assessment of what we mean by quality in care. So ensuring that people are, yes, empowered, but also that services are becoming much more person-centered. So I say it's really the latter 2 approaches, and they've kind of come together almost in recent years. So the scientific and consumerist approach, they've really had a very strong influence on how quality is being defined in practice across different countries. Okay, so I thought it'd be helpful to break down what we understand by quality in long-term care a bit more. So there are different approaches, and I think we've seen examples, particularly of the first one in the presentation. So I'm quite glad that I was thinking that this is probably the most common approach, is what I've labeled here as a dimensions approach to thinking about quality. And essentially what you're doing here is thinking about the kind of different aspects of quality that are important in this particular context. So here we have the dimensions that were identified by the OECD in their work, A Good Life in Old Age. They actually identified these dimensions through synthesizing frameworks used by many, many different countries across the world. And they identify these four aspects. So they identify care effectiveness. Essentially, we're thinking about whether care is producing the desired results. User safety, I don't need to say much about what that means. Person-centeredness, responsiveness, and empowerment. So here we see that consumerist or kind of empowerment aspect coming through, and actually the definition of the aspects that are important in this context. And then also care coordination and integration. So this is important in this context because of the type of people we're talking about. So these are people with multiple morbidities, multiple problems, that are often moving between lots of different services, or they have lots of different services coming to them. And it's really important that there's a kind of information sharing, but also that the transitions between these different services are as smooth as possible. So that is really important in this context and why it's highlighted. So the second approach that I've highlighted here is the approach taken by Don Abedian. I'm sure many of you, if you've done any work in the area of quality, will have heard his name. It's everywhere. His work is everywhere. But what he really provides is an approach for thinking about a kind of logical organization of measures of quality. So he identifies three different types of quality measures. So ones that are sort of structural measures. So here we're thinking about things that are perhaps more tangible, so attributes of the settings or the organization or jobs, things that are much easier to kind of count and observe, really. Then we're also thinking, he also identifies process measures. So here he's talking about what's being done in the giving and receiving of care, so measures that relate really to the delivery of care. And finally, he identifies outcome measures. And he talks about outcome measures as being the effect of care on individuals, their families, and that kind of wider care network. So the final way that I'd like to identify as a way of thinking about quality is what I've identified as a levels approach. So here I'm just really reflecting the fact that you might want to think about assessing quality at different levels. So if we take it for granted that care is fundamentally relational, as I always argue it is, it's fundamentally about the relationship between the cared for person and the caregiver, then it would be really important to think about assessing quality at that level, so assessing the quality of that relationship. We might want to take a step up and also then think about whether we want to think about assessing quality at the level of the organization. So we've heard in previous presentations about how important the organizational setting and what's going on in it can be on the relationship, on the outcomes of care that people receive. So we might want to think about assessing quality at that level too. And indeed, that's what happens with a lot of inspections. They're inspecting the care home, they're inspecting the agencies, they're looking at assessing quality at that level. And then finally, systems similarly, it can have an impact and it can constrain what organizations and what people can do within kind of delivery of care. So again, we might want to think about and assess quality at the level of the system as well. Okay, and then outcomes. So I've already mentioned outcomes when I discussed quality in the previous slide, but what I've done here is just really try and expand upon Don Abedian's approach with some examples to really illustrate the difference, I suppose, I hope, more between outcomes and the other measures of quality of long-term care. So if we see here on the left-hand side, we start with the structural measures of quality. So here we're really talking about, as I said before, that context within which care is taking place. So I've got a picture of a care home here that was given an outstanding rating, I think, by judging by the balloons that they've got outside. Then the second aspect that he talks about is process measures of quality. So here we're talking about actions between the workers and people receiving care. So I've got a couple of pictures here, both relating to feeding. So in one, a lady is being given her meal by a care worker. And in the second one, a lady is being fed, but this is through a PEG tube. So in both cases, we've got the same kind of care, type of care being delivered, but it's being delivered in a very different way. And then finally, we have the outcome measures, which, as I said, are really capturing the effect of that care. So through the different ways that it's being delivered on the individuals, their families, and their care network. But one of the important things I wanted to highlight here is that because quality is subjective, the different parties in that relationship, and indeed in the home and generally, are perhaps going to have quite different views and assess outcomes from receiving, in this instance, it's food, by quite different criteria. So the lady who's receiving the meal, she might be thinking, oh, great, I really love this meal. It's absolutely one of my favorites. I'm really, really happy with this. And they've given it to me at a time when I'm feeling hungry. So that's wonderful. And I'm getting all the food I like, and I'm getting it when I want, tick, I'm, absolutely top outcome for me. But the care worker may be thinking about it quite differently. So they may be thinking and looking at the meal the lady's received. They may see that she's drunk all her drink and think, that's good. I can see she's hydrated, tick. They may be looking at the fact that she's got, a well-balanced meal on her plate, and she's eating for all the different kind of food groups. They can see that she's getting a balanced dietary intake, it's nutritional, and they would think, yeah, tick, okay, that's a good outcome there. So just really kind of just putting to you that it's quite, the way we think about outcomes is quite different depending on who we are, our perspective, what we have access to in terms of what we can observe. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention before I move on, so breaking down long-term care outcomes a little bit more, is that because long-term care is fundamentally relational, we can think about outcomes for the individual, but we also should be thinking about outcomes for workers as well. They're equally important in this relationship. And sometimes, they do get a bit neglected. So just then breaking down what we mean by long-term care outcomes a little bit more. So I would say that there's broadly two different approaches that people have taken over the years to defining long-term care outcomes. You have on the one hand, what is a much more deficit-based kind of negative approach that tends to align really with a vision that sees care as being there to prevent or slow down deterioration. It's much more clinical in its kind of basis. And then on the other hand, you have a much more kind of positive, compensational, sort of strength-based approach to defining outcomes or dimensions of outcomes. And this, I would say, aligns with a vision of care that's there more to maintain well-being, quality of life, and personhood. So a lot of things that were mentioned earlier on in some of the earlier presentations. So I've given you a list of kind of some of the dimensions that are used to assess outcomes, right, in these different types of approaches. So the ones on the left are coming largely from the inter-eye measure, which is a very popular measure that's being used to capture outcomes and indeed quality more generally from long-term care. You can see they're pretty clinical, these types of indicators. And then on, well, at least it's my right, we've got the Ascot measure of social care and quality of life, and these are the domains from Ascot. So I would say that over time, people have moved much more towards this kind of more positive approach to assessing outcomes, but certainly within perhaps those domains of long-term care, which are more kind of clinically dominated, you will see a lot more kind of evidence of this kind of more deficit approach to assessing outcomes of long-term care. Okay, so I'm getting towards the end, Adelina, just in case you're getting worried. Okay, so I said I'd talk about why we sometimes get in a bit of a mess about quality and outcomes. And the reason I think this is largely the case is because we tend to see outcomes as the kind of ultimate validator of quality. So in the sense, if everything's working really well, people should just have fantastic outcomes. They should have great outcomes. But the challenge is that outcomes are really, really hard to measure well. And there are 3 reasons for this, essentially. The first is that they're just very difficult to observe. So we've mentioned that some of those outcomes are just fundamentally subjective. So if we think about one of the dimensions that there was under the quality of life measure of Ascot, it was about control over daily life. You know, only an individual can have access to the idea of whether they have control over their daily life. There might be ways of observing it, and my colleague Anne-Marie Towers could talk to you at length about how you could try and do that, but it's certainly a high cost approach that you would need to employ in order to measure and to observe something that's highly subjective, like control over daily life. Which takes me on to the second point, which is that it's very difficult to collect these outcome measures often. So as I said, some of them are highly subjective. You need to really be asking people what they're thinking. And we're talking about people in care homes a lot here. And these are people with severe dementia, and we might have people with very profound learning disabilities. People might be nonverbal, so they might not have capacity to self-report. So you need to find another mechanism. As I said, that might be an expensive approach. You will also find that you need quite specialized tools to measure some of these outcomes reliably. And related to that, observers then need quite a bit of training to conduct the measurement well. And certainly you see that with the use of Inter-Eye in the US. People need quite a lot of training to be doing and using those tools. Then finally, we see that these outcome measures are actually often quite difficult to interpret. And that's because they may not be actually attributable to the care that's received. So if we take as an example here something like weight loss, we can observe somebody's weight loss over time, but weight loss can have a variety of causes. It's not necessarily linked to the feeding or hydration of the individual. It might be an infection. Now, an infection is not a good thing, but it's not necessarily related to the aspects of care delivery that we might be interested in here, which might be around feeding and hydration and so on. So it can be very challenging to interpret some of these outcome measures and understand what you need to do in terms of taking action to correct. So what happens as a consequence of that is we tend to see that structural and process measures of quality are generally substituted as indicators of outcomes, just because they're much easier to observe, they're much easier to collect, and also really a lot easier to interpret because they directly relate to either things you can see or processes that you know are taking place. So it's easier to take corrective actions and interpret what's going on. Okay, so then just finally, just wrapping up, my 4 kind of key points to take away from this, that talking about quality, we're talking about the goodness or worth of something, but to capture it, we can't just use one indicator. We are going to need a whole bunch of indicators. I think that's been highlighted very nicely by people who've spoken before. Outcomes refer to the results of long-term care provision for individuals or indeed a kind of collective. And outcomes we think of generally as being the ultimate arbiter of long-term care quality, but they are really difficult to measure well. And as a consequence, sometimes structural and process quality measures are used as indicators of outcomes just because they're a lot easier to measure. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you in this session and all of you who've stayed so late. We do have 9 minutes left for discussion, and if there's any hands, any comments in the box, you can ask things from one presenter to another, of course. And I see Martin's comment screen. I wonder if that's precursor to a question. No pressure.
It's not a question. I'm just amazed by what I've heard. I can't believe how much I've learned in these very short presentations. I couldn't join the whole day, but been online for about an hour and a half. So apologies, I'm lightweight compared to some of you being here since early morning. But there's so much rich stuff. So I think the more that can be shared around, the better. So I don't have a particular question because I'm just absorbing everything, but it's just really fantastic amount of information. So thank you very much.
We will be sharing videos, so you'll be able to catch up at your leisure and at any time of the day as well. From my point of view, it was very interesting to see the different ways in which we've been talking about quality and also approaches to support quality improvement. And I'm very interested in this very different methods from some that are, and as Juliette was explaining, about the structure, the process, and some that are about supporting improvement, and some that are about creating a discussion on how to move towards improvement. So this is me kind of trying to think about what we've seen. And of course, the challenge then for Cassandra from WHO to try and how to look at this across countries when it's even so different within the same country or the same locality. I see a hand by Kimberly Cottendom, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, it's Andrea. I work with Kimberly Cottingham, but we're from Canada. We're working on in long-term care research, and this has been a great day. It was well worth it because it's been difficult in Canada because there's really, Pat Armstrong's early work was excellent, but we see from our research some very disturbing trends, and we just found it interesting, the different perspectives. So it gave us more information to continue our argumentation around quality. And actually, there's very little change. And I think some of the presenters in Canada, it's different in different provinces, but given, and one of the presenters talked about the investment, it's quite scary that we continue to build very large facilities and don't focus on staffing and things like that. So we found it just a great day. So thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. And next year we'll be featuring many more people from Canada and North America. We have a plan for that. Stay tuned. So Bellis,
that's great. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. I saw your hand, Bellis, and then Cassandra.
Yeah, I would like to respond on the presentation of Juliette about the process and structure indicators. I think we also are thinking about this learning culture as an important process of quality improvement, and this kind of the sense of learning organization as an indicator of quality. And that was the main idea of this quality framework we implemented, that you can't measure these outcomes very well, but you can measure and invest in this learning culture to be responsive and to learn, like the cycles Cassandra showed. You can learn all the time. And if you arrange this cycle very well, then you have something like quality embedded in your organization.
Thank you. We'll hear from Cassandra and then Milan and Juliette.
Yeah, thank you. I had a couple of comments and reactions to some of the other presentations, but also what you just mentioned, Adelina. Something that I took from several of the presenters today is, again, this idea of continuous learning and this culture of openness, in a sense. And I think I've seen this also in some of the work that I've done in my time working as a consultant with WHO, that it does really start with this culture of having an openness to have these discussions. Mm-hmm. I've seen in some of our work, often in some cases when there's not this open culture where people feel comfortable to openly discuss and to report things, there's this feeling that, I can't actually report some of the challenges or some of the issues because I have fear that there might be some retaliation against me by my employer or by authorities and so on. So I think this is really a fundamental aspect, being able to have this open culture, and for care workers and providers to feel that they can actually honestly speak without feeling that they're going to be retaliated against is a really important part. Juliette's presentation I found also interesting, and I just want to say, you said it's reassuring what you were presenting aligns with what we were presenting, but I see it the other way around as well. It's reassuring that the work that we're doing is well aligned with research too. But I think absolutely when we think about how we measure quality and the fact that we need to branch out from just outcomes, this is something we've also seen in our work and that we advocate for. As helpful and as useful as user-reported outcomes are, it doesn't neglect that we still need to have some of these structural and process measures also, so that we have a more complete picture of what quality looks like. And then finally, I just wanted to raise one point. I think it wasn't Kimberly. I'm sorry, I missed what your name was because it's misleading your name there. But you were talking about how about how continuously these big care homes are being built when really what we need to be doing is investing in smaller, more personalized centered models. And I think this really relates to, first of all, having financing models in place that allow providers to actually, implement and have smaller sized homes. But also it's part of establishing standards and establishing guidelines for what care homes look like in terms of size. So I take a lot of this with me. It's been a really interesting webinar. So thank you so much, everyone, for your perspectives. Thanks.
Milan, if you want to quickly comment a bit about how the regulators in Holland are thinking about these more reflexive methods and in changing their practice, and how do you see this changing in the future, maybe?
Yeah, I think this difficult to measureness is really like is really the topic of discussion there at the regulators now, and I think we also need to sometimes accept that it's maybe difficult to measure, but and trust in this performative effect that we have. Just if we focus on something, that will also like trickle down to the rest of us, and that there's also like a pedagogical perspective in this, that it's not only the effectiveness but of the actions and where you focus on, but also the potential educational value or pedagogical value of it. So if you focus on if the regulator focuses on listening to people, they also share the idea that they find it important that other people listen. And it's not only about knowing if it's also trusting that process, that like sharing what you find important, that it will also have an effect on the rest. But yeah, it's difficult because it's so difficult to measure. But yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
And we'll continue the conversation. Juliette, you get to have the last word.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up the point about culture and also that kind of idea of a learning organization. I mean, it's certainly something that's come through from work that I've been doing around innovation as well. And so those organizations that were by far that were very innovative, and by that I mean that they were doing lots of things. So it wasn't just they'd implemented one thing that came down from on high, but there was things that they developed themselves, and then they bring in another piece of tech, or they develop another way of engaging with their residents or engaging with the community. So the ones that are really doing lots of different things have a very strong focus on culture of the organization and doing a lot of those things that you were talking about. So yeah, not having a kind of people getting kind of told off if they're doing something. They have that kind of sort of positive approach to risk. That they really focus a lot on kind of embedding some of these values in the organizations. They do a huge amount of culture work, kind of recognizing essentially that because there's so much turnover of staff, you have to kind of constantly be on top of that, because it can very, very quickly change. So that focus on culture is really important. But alongside that, they have certainly developed as learning organizations over time. So they're very good at kind of capturing what it is they're doing. So, not just learning about how could we be better at implementing this innovation, but also learning about the process of innovating and capturing that, and then learning about the learning, the process. So those kind of 3 levels of learning, you see them being very good at all these things, and that really developing over time. So it really is critical. But I mean, it's one of those things that you see as being, this is what you hear the change management literature. It's there. All of these things are critical to change management. I mean, I wonder whether there's something about this particular context that, because it is so in flux, I mean, I know we've had care homes for donkey's years, but the other hand, you have a very difficult policy environment. We have a very difficult environment in terms of the workforce. You have this constant turnover of staff, constant movement of managers. Maybe it's something about this environment that means you actually need to be constantly doing change, constantly focusing on that culture. I mean, just might be a kind of really interesting sort of idea to potentially be exploring as we think about why it is that perhaps the organization and those features of the organization matter so much to quality in this context.
Thank you.
Anyway,
and
maybe we can continue the conversation around that. Sorry, Adelina, I jumped in.
We will.
Just as
We
you
will
thought I
continue.
finished.
We will continue the conversation. I'm delighted we have a new quality improvement interest group. So hopefully, I'll see some of you there. During the day, we've heard a lot of things. So we started with unmet needs. We then heard some really innovative examples of community-based care. I think some really exciting initiatives in different countries, very different contexts as well. We've heard about financing with a focus on low and middle income countries, and quite a lot of innovation happening there as well that I think we can all learn from. We've heard about workforce, which of course cuts across everything. So, you know, even here we're hearing about people changing jobs all the time and the challenges that poses for quality. All these issues cut across. So it's very much about having a good system. We've heard about care homes of the future. Again, that requires investment. It requires maybe also some regulation tools and quality of care. So I think that's been an amazing day. Some of you have been up for all day, I know that. Some of you are in time zones where I'm really worried you might be very tired. So thank you very much and hope to see you at our next events. And thank you for celebrating the UN's Day of Care and Support. Bye.